I'm Janna Saslaw, and I teach music theory to the sophomore class. I teach music theory 3 and 4. And then I also teach an upper level class called Form and Analysis, which sometimes has some grad students, and it's called Style Analysis. And that's a lot of fun. And then I teach another class, I team teach with Bill Horn, and it's called Student Composers Forum. And that's a music composition workshop for anybody. Anybody can be in that class. I play flute and some piano. I started piano first, and then I learned the flute. And mostly these days I perform on the flute. I play everything from piccolo to bass flute, and that's a lot of fun. Just did a recording session yesterday, so I try to keep playing. I do improvised music. I like to do that. And then in school, I liked to study music theory. I was really into music theory, so I ended up getting a master's and a doctorate in music theory at Columbia University. And actually my doctorate is music history and music theory together. And so I'm really glad to be able to teach in that area. I have a really wide definition of music theory. I think that music theory is, anytime you're thinking, that's a G chord, that's a music theory. Anytime you're thinking, okay, how do I sing this melody in the key of F? That's music, you're using music theory. So it's really important. It's a general skill that musicians really need to know. Part of what I teach is reading and being able to not just see the notes, but to kind of put them together and know what's going on. And it gives you that really great feeling of being kind of with the composer. You're like, I know how you did that. So this is something that all musicians need to know. I help people improve their keyboard skills, but not just playing the piano, knowing what they're playing. I help people improve their sight reading, their listening and knowing what they're hearing. And I have the most fun helping people understand what's going on in music. So what was Beethoven doing in this piano sonata? What was Mozart doing? What was Bach up to in his chorale settings? And I like it as a kind of psychological study. It's like getting into somebody else's head, which is kind of fun because you're in your own head most of the time. So. You can do it either way. I mean, clearly, if you're playing or singing something, you have to have the technique to be able to produce some sound. But music theory really helps you to organize it in your head, because music is something that only exists in time and then in memory. And music theory is what really helps you to remember what you did and to organize what you're about to do. And it can actually make you have a greater sense of confidence, because you can be like, all right, this is not just some random thing, a string of notes that I'm about to perform. It's going to be, a C major 7 followed by an F7, or it's going to be a 2-5-1 progression, or it's going to be modal counterpoint in Dorian mode or something like that. And in other words, it helps you to take in the whole thing. As a flutist, if I'm looking at a passage and I notice that it's in a whole tone scale, then my fingers hook into automatic. So this enables you to do that and just have fun with figuring out what music's up to. I love Beethoven symphonies and piano sonatas. That's one of the most fun things to teach. And I love Brahms as well. Brahms, almost anything. But right now, my students are working on, in form and analysis class, we're analyzing a Beethoven piano sonata in G minor, opus 49, number 1, just the first movement. And there's just so much fun that you can get out of these pieces, because you can get into, it's a little tiny piece, and you can get into what's the form, how did he put it together in the large scale. You can get into, okay, what's the tune that you would remember? You know, what are the themes? Where do they come back? What harmonies did he use to kind of establish what's going on at the beginning? What harmonies did he use to take you to some wild places in the middle? How does he get you back home, so to speak? You know, a sonata can be thought of as starting off somewhere. You meet somebody who's your main theme, and then they go through a bunch of changes. They go through a trip, you know, and they have a kind of a life, and then they come back home at the end. And it's, you know, what have they learned through all this drama? In the 16th century, you know, when people think of the old masses of Palestrina, or even madrigals to some extent, generally people were thinking in terms of different lines that were flowing and interacting with each other in intervals. You know, this ends on a cadence at the perfect octave with a fifth, and if you're Palestrina, you can add a third in there. And then later on, people started to think, I think particularly when music ended up being rhythmically more lining up together, people started to think, hey, wait a minute, you know, when I have a third and a fifth and an octave, if I have, you know, if I take the bottom note and I put it on top, it's still the same kind of sound. So there arose a concept of inversions, and that this is a chord. And that only happened really in the 17th century, and then things developed into the 18th century. So even at the time of Bach in the early 18th century, people were still thinking a lot in terms of, it was kind of a combination between, they really were aware of all the little lines interacting, but they understood that maybe these came together in chords. And you can see kind of both ways of thinking. And finally, in the classical period, they kind of moved more toward thinking just about chords. But, you know, folks like Mozart, he didn't ignore counterpoint. Listen to any Mozart symphony development section, and you'll hear a lot of counterpoint. And Brahms loved counterpoint.
Chopin.
Yep. I mean, all the Romantic composers, and even into the 20th century, composers, you know, still loved the combination of counterpoint and harmony. They're just kind of two ways of thinking of the same thing. A lot of the methods that people use to analyze 20th century music were developed for music that wasn't necessarily easy to figure out as tonal music. When we talk about tonal music, we mean music from about 17th century through the late 19th century, and of course into the 20th, you know, pop tunes are still tonal. But there was music that some people called atonal. Even Arnold Schoenberg, who is one of the first people you think of when you say the word atonal, he liked the word pantonal. It's because atonal he said to himself, well, that means no key, and I like to think of my music as all keys, so pantonal. But these methods, that when people talk about 20th century theory, they mean music that assumes that it's not really a tonal circumstance. So music to describe everything from middle Schoenberg through his students, Webern and Berg, even more recent folks, American composer Milton Babbitt, There are segments of 20th century theory like 12-tone theory. That's a way of organizing all 12 chromatic pitches. There is music that's very different from the 60s, music by Stockhausen and music by Pierre Boulez. Boulez's style has changed, but people often think of sort of sound masses and just, awesome textures and stuff like that. And there are ways in 20th century theory to deal with, when you have a piece by Krzysztof Penderecki that has just a huge collection of simultaneous sounds. You can analyze it as a flow of registers or a flow of blocks of form or various other ways. So music has really changed in the 20th century, and theory has tried to keep up. Most of the time theory responds to styles of music. It tries to figure out how you can write music in a particular style, but also, once you've heard a particular style, how does it work? So it goes kind of both ways. It looks forward, how can we compose something in the future? That's theory is kind of a composer's chops. And then in another way, somebody could say, oh, I heard this great piece. Let me figure out what's going on. Ooh, no other theory has really figured out how to deal with this piece, so I'm going to come up with my own. Even at the time, people were really impressed by Wagner's music as being something new, and one of the labels you may know is the music of the future. And I think one of the things that Wagner's music, I think that he tried to do in his own music, was to be completely dramatic in service of his drama the whole time. He didn't want to have any filler that was just there to end the phrase. He didn't want to have anything that didn't apply to, if I'm writing an opera about the story of the medieval hero Tristan, then everything in that work has to focus on that story. He didn't want to have, in a Mozart opera, you might have a stopping point at the end of a piece of music, a little aria or some number that you could separate out of the opera. Wagner didn't want to do that. So he wanted his music to be continuous unless the characters stopped. If the characters didn't just stop living, then the music didn't either. One of the great things about Wagner that I love is that he has these, another kind of formal device that they call leading motives or leitmotifs. And he can have these things, characters and characters, things, symbols, everything has a little tune. And so he can have the orchestra play this tune and you know what a character is thinking. There's a beautiful scene in Wagner's second opera in the Ring cycle, the Valkyrie, Die Walküre, where the king of the gods, Wotan, is thinking about his children, but he's not saying anything. But you hear their leitmotifs in the orchestra. And it's just very poignant because he doesn't have to say anything. And you can just imagine him thinking where he's not saying anything either. The orchestra is telling you everything. And then, harmonically, if you want to express something about giants and dwarves and gods and men and all this stuff, you might want to come up with some new way of expressing it. So as a theorist, I look at what he did harmonically along with the motives, along with everything else, and formally. So all those things could be part of an analysis. Or you could think of, it could be music theory if you think about texture. And, is it a very thick texture? Wagner's textures were notoriously so thick that the singers had a hard time performing, and you had to put the orchestra behind them instead of in front of them, because otherwise you couldn't hear the singers. So there's all kinds of aspects, the rhythm. You can just, do a theory of rhythm. I once did a paper, I guess you could say it was a theory paper in grad school about Wagner's use of melody in his opera Tristan. Was it aria-like melody? Was it like a song, or was it more like speaking, or was it something halfway in between?
What you conclude?
I concluded all of the above. Just as I said, when Wagner doesn't want to have anything just be set as a block and then you go on to the next block, he wants to have everything move fluidly, just like the characters do, just like the drama does. So when Wagner has somebody kind of reflect on something, maybe they'll sing aria style, but if they're yelling at somebody and having a big quick interaction that's making the plot move forward really quickly, they might use a more speaking style, or they might be somewhere halfway in between. So he really flows back and forth, and in that paper, I just traced how it went, how he flowed back and forth between musically beautiful sections and dramatically, what do I want to say? Things that focus on the lyrics, the dramatically important sections. Some people compare music theory to math or to puzzle solving, because in a way you're saying, how does this go? What's in it? You could think of the fact that you might be dissecting a piece of music. And I do think that in general, music theory helps you with abstract thinking, because you have to kind of imagine, if I'm in a particular key, how does it relate to another key? A key, where is a key? It's sort of in your imagination, because it might not be literally in the piece unless you're singing, joy to the world, the Lord is come. Well, that's a major scale going down, but most pieces don't sit there and present easily recognizable scales and chords. So sometimes you have to imagine and put them together and find what's the collection, what's the source from which all this music that I'm listening to is drawn from. And so it really does help you kind of organize your musical thoughts and think in abstract terms, think creatively, and to kind of get an attitude in which you say, I'm not just going to be satisfied with mechanically doing something. I want to understand it. I would recommend a creative musical life because it just never ceases to give you more fun things to do, more interesting things to do, more fascinating things to do. You just, one of our departmental T-shirts that I think actually the students made up years ago was, I can't, I have rehearsal. And that can extend to all musical activities. It can just fill up your life and give you plenty of stuff to do. You'll never be bored. And not only that, if you know and understand music, you'll always have stimulating things to think about.